Well, go on. So UFC Fight Night Paris, Imavov versus Borralho is only a week out at this point, and we're going to get into how that matchup actually looks like between the two. This is going to be one of the two most important fights in the UFC's middleweight division going on right now, with the next one being Reiner de Ridder versus Anthony Hernandez. For a lot of people, this fight is going to be the one that's actually the quote unquote unofficial number one contender fight. It's going to be between France's Nassourdine Imavov and Brazil's Caio Borralho of the Fighting Nerds. I know that this one definitely could is going to be the next determinant of who's going to be Hamza Shemaev's next opponent. With the only likely way in how that doesn't happen is if the victor of this matchup has like an incredibly underwhelming and or lackluster performance. Other than that, they're basically going to be guaranteed to be the next person in. Got some notes here I want to get into and see what I think and really explain my thoughts and how I see this going between the two. First of all, I actually think, for me personally, I actually think that this is undoubtedly the best stylistic matchup in the UFC's middleweight division. I know that a lot of people are also pretty big on the Reiner de Ridder versus Dricus du Plessis. With that being, I would say that that's probably the only other exception. Clash of the Toonverse, basically, if that were to ever happen, you'd see walls caving in and fucking reality being warped in that matchup. So that'll definitely be a fun time to see. But between Boralho and Imavov, from their size to their reach to even their fight style, I believe that this is definitely going to be the matchup that really is the most. Both, I think this is the matchup that they both have the best and worst chance of winning, meaning that this is the matchup that they basically would have to fight against somebody who is incredibly similar to themselves in a lot of ways, and that could both be an easier time to figure out, but also be a harder time to figure out, because you'd basically have to be countering yourself in a lot of ways. But just because I say that they're incredibly similar, I don't think that they're the exact same. And I definitely have the person who I believe is going to be the victor in that matchup and has the greater advantage. But let's get into it. First off, I'd probably say that right now, in terms of this matchup, there's going to everyone, for the most part, is in one of three camps. There's the camp that believes that Imavov is undoubtedly the best fighter outside of the current champion in the UFC's middleweight division. Or if not the best fighter, at the very least, they believe that he is the certified number one contender and that he is the one who is the best, has the best likelihood of obtaining that UFC championship glory. Then there's the camp that believes that the fighting nerds, and with Caio being the leader of such group, are basically unstoppable right now, with the only exception being that loss that Carlos Pratis recently had against Ian Gary. And a lot of people believe that to be a quote unquote type of fluke, especially since the fight ended with Carlos basically chasing down Ian Gary and almost getting that finish at the very end. And then the third camp would be the ones that believe that Boralho is the best fighter and he is the best contender in the division right now. I'd say the reason why I drew a distinction between the fighting nerds camp and specifically the Caio Borralho camp is because despite having a lot of overlap, these are not the exact same group. With the fighting nerds, especially with how much momentum and victory and just the overall body of work they've been putting together in the UFC so far, a lot of people have kind of been cultivated by that cult of personality. And it's kind of one of those you just can't see them being doing no wrong. However, a lot of the things that that group has ended up being known for, the dynamic finishes and the great moveset, Caio himself, despite being the leader, is not necessarily indicative of that specific style and defining trait. Caio has actually been more so of a quote unquote decision merchant um, within the majority of his fights. even though he has had very impressive showings and more or less had kind of a bit of a dominant run up to his current position himself, but he hasn't really been putting on the super highlight real KOs like how the rest of the group has been. Well, with the exception of Bruno Brazil. But anyways, as I was saying, with the camp of Caio Borralho, there are those people who believe that he within him and of himself is the best contender right now and the best fighter in the UFC middleweight division. But I would personally say that that is a completely separate group from the people who have just been overall captivated by the cult of personality and the overall performance of the fighting nerds as a group. But let's get into some of the similarities that these two guys have. First of all, they both have very similar styles. Like their similarities from their reach to their fight style to even their stance. Like there's significant amount of way in how they look. They both are very good strikers that each have a very good grappling game and a grappling background. Both of them are actually they actually have very similar finish rates, like with Imavov having four and Caio having three. It's funny because they both have a controversial performance against Jared Cannonier as well, with Imavov's finish against Cannonier being considered an early stoppage by a lot of fans, and then Caio, on the other hand, being someone who his victory against Cannonier be considered that it should have been a stoppage. These were within literally in back-to-back fights, which is actually a great starting point. Both of these guys are actually very good pressure fighters. But when I say pressure fighter, I don't just mean, oh, they're fighters who just march forward. When I say a pressure fighter, I mean it not as a strategy, but as a fight style. In specifics, both of these are fighters that, as opposed to just being in the game plan to go forward, it is specifically an ingrained part of their style to go forward, regardless of who the opponent is. And they both have noticeable differences in style if you're forced to go backwards. An example of an actual pressure fighter would be somebody like Rainer de Ritter or even Anthony Fluffy Hernandez himself. And even Hamzat, it could be somebody who could be is considered a pressure fighter, especially when you look at how he starts the first round, regardless of who the opponent is. His direct forward motion isn't a strategy. It's specifically an ingrained part of his fight style. I know that there can be a lot of confusion because yeah, everybody goes forward and it's fighting. So like everyone's goal is going forward. But it's a bit different from an example of somebody like an Alex Pereira or even a Tom Aspinall, where yeah, they're both known for their brutal knockouts and they both march down their opponents a lot. But if you actually witness both of them as individual fighters, they're both they go where they're dominant and they will make this more of a chess match and they will change the strategy if necessary. But it's not just a I'm going forward, I'm board forcing the motion, I'm just bulldozing regardless of who it is on whatever the situation is. There are different game plans and differences. Even somebody like Izzy, who you notice that a lot of his game plan, if you actually watch his fights, he's a lot more of a counter puncher, he's a lot more waiting. Like that's very different from an actual pressure fighter who his entire game is dictated on him marching forward as a part of his just individual fight style. Now, I kind of slightly touched on some of the similarities between them, but to get more into a bit more detail on some of the differences between them, some of the obvious ones are Imavov is from a wrestling background, whereas Caio Borralho is from a jiu-jitsu background. So that will be a slight interest when it comes to the grappling exchanges. There's also, they both very much prefer to stick with the striking whenever possible. However, that's a bit that comfortability is a bit different because Imavov is a striker who actually comes from a boxing background and added his wrestling to it, whereas Caio is a bit of the opposite. He's a grappler from the jiu-jitsu background that built striking on top of it. Now, when you look at these two matchups, it leads to Imavov actually having a bit more comfortability with the striking, even though they both very obviously and dominantly prefer to strike as much as possible. But Imavov is the one who is a lot cleaner, a lot more technical, a lot sharper, a lot more polished in his striking, whereas Caio Borralho is a lot more gritty. He's the one to make it a lot more dirty. He's the one who's a lot less refined, but a lot more determined. Like he'll kind of will through. His punch is a lot more. You might see him appear a bit sloppier when it comes to like a technical aspect, and he'll kind of make up for that technique with grit and determination, and just once again, just that forward motion in those times. Getting into it a little bit more, Imavov is already considered by a lot of people to be the quote unquote uncrowned number one contender. A lot of people felt as if, especially with that last performance he just had against Israel Adesanya, that he's actually the person in the division who's earned the opportunity the most. I know that there's a lot of people who probably feel like it's a bit unfair that he even needs to go out of his way and prove it one more time. And then, especially when you're not including Rainer the Ritter into the conversation and his kind of storm through the division, there's a lot of people who feel as if Imavov is being overlooked or he's constantly being kind of jumped in the line, despite having that pretty exciting performance and such a kind of really good roster of names he's been gathering. Imavov does have two losses in the UFC so far, and those are where I get into a bit more detailed on how this matchup actually looks for him. And when I said that he was a pressure fighter, that is one of the issues I'm talking about. Imavov as a pressure fighter, because his game consists of him going forward so much, he actually struggles a lot whenever he's the one who's forced to go backwards. You can see this in the Sean Strickland fight and how that matchup ended up going, where a lot of the times for those first couple of rounds where Imavov had a lot of difficulty was basically Strickland, who he himself can be considered a pressure fighter in a lot of ways. And because he was so much superior with the pressure, and he also, even himself, was a lot more comfortable having to fight backwards when necessary, he was able to kind of force the momentum a lot more, and Imavov kind of just buckled under that. And whenever he ended up countering, he ended up Strickland ended up being in a situation where he just adapted. Since he was so much more comfortable going backwards, he was able to readjust a lot more comfortably and efficiently than Imavov, and then reset the pressure. And Imavov kind of just withered under that, despite being the one of the two who had a full camp in preparation for that matchup. And Strickland being the one who come up in short notice, he still ended up losing in that type of clash of forces. And the same thing happened in his loss against Phil Hawes. Similar situation in which, even though he was a lot newer, a lot fresher in the game at that point, he had a lot less comfortability. He still had enormous difficulty against an opponent who was forcing the action and really was just kind of overwhelmed him and forced him to wither away against the output. So that is one of the biggest holes in his games, despite. But Imavov, don't get me wrong, just because I say that Imavov struggles when he's being pressured doesn't mean that he's just gonna go away because if Caio Borralho ends up just turning up the heat a little bit. That's not the case. Imavov has had a lot of fights himself that people tried to pressure him, and he kind of, because of how technical and how fast he is and how good, like that is one of his greatest advantages, his ability to adapt and adjust throughout the fight. And we've seen him grow over time, and we've seen him really have constant improvement in each of his fights. So that was one of the things that we've witnessed when a lot of other opponents just try to outward pressure him without being as effective at it as, let's say, as Strickland was. He kind of has that moment where he steps back a little bit, which is one of the issues. He kind of will back up, and then he'll charge back in, and this time he'll kind of download your information and adjust that accurately. You saw that in the Jared Cannonier matchup, where those first two rounds, Cannonier was always in his face, and Cannonier had that kind of had that advantage, that experience, that power. Cannonier really forced him back, but once he started downloading it, and he, by the time the third round came around, he started picking up a lot of Cannonier's tendencies. A lot of the time, instead of going back, he just countered. Instead of backing up straight up, he went forward as well. And then he started getting the better of those forward exchanges. And then he just started withering down more and more and more until that eventual finish came. So that is thing, and that is one of the most dangerous aspects of Imavov's game, just how technical and accurate he can be. But once again, he struggles against people who are willing to fully pressure. So that definitely, yeah, that definitely is going to be one of his struggles against someone like Caio Borralho, especially when we get into it. Borralho style, once again, Borralho is very similar to Imavov, being that kind of striker grappler, like relying on his hands a lot, having a lot of power, despite not boasting like a crazy high finish rate. They both are very, very strong fighters, and any clean shot, they could put each other out. You just saw it with Imavov when he did it against Israel Adesanya, and the same thing in that would be finish against Cannonier that Borralho had. They were getting into an exchange, and Borralho was the one who got the better of Cannonier in that moment. And that shot discombobulated him, and then he completely pounced on him. That is one of the things. However, to stay on that same point, that's where somebody like Borralho could be a really tricky opponent for Imavov, because they both have the exact same reach. That creates an issue for Imavov, who somebody who both of them have had that advantage for most of their UFC career of kind of being taller, longer fighters, meaning that they could get to their opponents without their opponents being able to get to them. You saw a lot of opponents struggle to make up that gap. You saw Cannonier struggled with it against both of them in certain different moments. You saw Joaquin Buckley really struggle against Imavov initially due to that difference in length and reach. And you really saw multiple opponents against them kind of missing a lot with them. But however, with these two against each other having identical reaches and as well as legs, that means that as long as they can touch their opponent can probably touch them. And that creates an added sense of danger that they both have to be in consideration of, especially somebody like Imavov who struggles when it comes to fighting backwards and struggles when it comes to being overwhelmed. We really saw that in the matchup against Joaquin Buckley as well, where the ending where Imavov was, in a lot of people's opinion, including my own, completely outclassing Buckley for those first two rounds. And by the third round, when he was a little bit more tired and he wasn't able to put him away and he wasn't able to get that finish in the second, and then Buckley came back with new determination and kind of threw caution to the wind. And Imavov was a little bit more tired, a little bit less technical, a little bit less determined. And then Buckley started connecting more. He started feeling that power more. He started getting overwhelmed more. And he ended up losing that third round. A couple of times he was in real danger if certain punches had connected. That becomes really dangerous against somebody like Caio, because Caio does have the history. Caio isn't as clean as Imavov is. Caio is a little bit slower, despite being a really fast opponent himself. He's a little bit slower than Imavov. However, when you look at fights like the Cannonier fight, you realize how gritty Caio is. Caio, despite originating from a grappling background, is a very, very good boxer. He's a very, very good striker. Caio will get in your face. Caio will get hit a lot more than Imavov has historically. However, he's willing to take those hits. Cannonier fight, you saw a lot of back and forth, as opposed to the Imavov fight that started off with a Cannonier being the one in the lead, and then it gradually shifted from Cannonier to Imavov, and it inched piece by piece more and more until eventually the finish came. In the case of Caio, it was a constant back and forth between the two. It was a lot. It was a lot more of a bit of a brawl in a lot of cases. They were really getting at each other more. You saw by the end, Caio was more injured than Imavov was in his showing against Cannonier. However, Caio's determination was showed. Whenever Caio was forced to go backwards, Caio had a better performance of still being dangerous while going back, by still having that grit, by still willing to get in your face, by still being just technical enough to land regardless of what time or point it was, but still being constantly aware of what was going on. So in that aspect, Kyle becomes a really, really dangerous opponent for Imavov. We saw with the Cannonier fight that Borralho was able to land that punch by still being in the pocket, still being able to exchange, regardless of how during the time or whatever danger the opponent was, and really go in for that finish, even though he didn't get it, and a lot of people think he should have. Whereas with Imavov in that type of clash, if you have these two opponents that are both incredible pressure fighters going against each other, if Imavov is the one who ends up losing that pressure exchange, and then not only does he now have to deal with an opponent that has an easier time reaching him, it's a lot harder. And then with Imavov often relying or resorting to the wrestling in order to change the tempo of the fight in those moments, Kaio's proficiency with jiu-jitsu becomes a complete added threat that just makes that fight constantly dangerous. I don't consider either of these two to be major submission threats. Don't get me wrong, they're both capable of getting submissions. They're both very proficient grapplers. However, when you look at their history, they both would rather go for that knockout, and they both kind of rely on the submission as a kind of attempt to close the show out if it already looks easy, but they don't have that history of really getting it against an opponent that's constantly in it. Whereas with the knockouts, they both have that power, they both have incredible speed, they both could always be threatening. Yet still, despite that, I don't see either of them submitting each other, but that knockout threat is definitely always looming. So how does a matchup between them actually look? In my opinion, how I see it going, I kind of see it being that initial clash of aggression. I see Borralho and Imavov kind of try to charge into each other to see who is the one who gains ground first. With Imavov being the faster, more technical fighter of the two, I actually see Imavov being the one who gets the better of those exchanges. I see Caio still being a constant danger and constant threat, but yet still just not being technical enough, and then lacking that submission threat. I see him not being technical enough and trying to force the grappling exchanges or just force himself in, especially since Caio actually has a really nasty blast double. But I see in those moments Imavov's creativity on the grappling, he's way too comfortable with the wrestling. He's too capable of not just straight up going for back takes, but also trying to having that center of gravity control and that wherewithal. I kind of see them having stalemates in the grappling exchange, regardless of whether it be Caio who initiates it or Imavov. I see them both basically nullifying each other's grappling, which often happens in grappling matches against top tier UFC fighters. See, it ends up resulting in more of a striking battle between the two. And when it comes to that, Imavov is simply the better striker. He's simply a lot faster. He's a lot more technical. While, yes, there's always that threat of the knockout, there's always that possibility of even just making a mistake or just a slip up or just that one shot getting through or that one moment where something just random happens. But in that battle, I simply can't pick against Imavov in that clash. I can't, I don't see him getting a submission on Caio, and I don't see Caio getting a submission on him. However, I see him being the more aggressive fighter. I see Caio trying to mix it up, try to mix in that grittiness, try to make it dirty boxing. But then, especially with them both having that similar reach, I think that also would make it be that they're able to maintain spacing a lot. It might become a bit more of a fest at certain times, but I see Caio's attempt to rush in and make it more dirty, leaving himself exposed in a lot of opportunities and a lot more prone to being countered. And we've seen what Imavov does when those openings are showed. See that kind of, I don't, however, despite saying all of that, and despite acknowledging the possibility of a finish and a knockout occurring, I don't see either of these two getting one against each other. I actually see this going to a decision over the 5 rounds. And in my opinion, I see it going more of a 48-47 decision in favor of Nassourdine Imavov. That more or less is my perspective on how I see this fight playing out and going. Y'all tell me what y'all think, though. Y'all give me your thoughts in the comment section. Like, share, subscribe. Let me know what all y'all think. Give me your perspectives. Y'all think I'm right? Y'all think I'm wrong? Y'all think I'm stupid? Y'all think I forgot to consider something else? Let me know in the comments down below. Either way, y'all end up having a great day. See y'all next time. Peace.